At 3:17 p.m. local time, somewhere in the southern Caribbean Sea, the ocean looked unusually peaceful. The surface was smooth, almost mirror-like, stretching cleanly toward the horizon. Visibility was excellent. There were no storms building in the distance, no crowded civilian traffic lanes, and nothing obvious that suggested the atmosphere should feel tense. In the middle of that operating area, a United States Navy aircraft carrier continued on a steady course through international waters. Its movement was routine. Its speed was consistent. Flight activity had been paused, and escort vessels were positioned in a familiar, protective pattern around it. From the outside, the formation looked calm, controlled, and completely ordinary. Then the radar display changed. Inside the carrier's operations center, a surface search screen refreshed, and 5 new contacts became clear. Venezuelan naval vessels. One by one, none of them looked especially unusual. Together, they told a different story. Within seconds of each other, all 5 adjusted course. Each one turned toward the carrier. There had been no radio message before the maneuver. No active AIS signals appeared. No clear navigational reasons showed on the plot. To the trained personnel watching the screen, the pattern stood out immediately. This did not look random. It looked organized. The contacts were recorded at once. Range, bearing, speed, course changes. Every detail was logged to the second.
The vessels were still far enough away to avoid an immediate safety concern, but their direction mattered. They were not simply moving past the carrier, they were closing in. They were not casually shadowing the formation, they were converging. On the bridge, the officer of the deck watched the same information appear across multiple systems. No one rushed. No one raised their voice. No dramatic order broke the silence. This was exactly how the U.S. Navy is built to operate in uncertain moments. Calm, precise, and deliberate. The carrier did not alter course. Under the rules in place, there had not yet been a direct, unsafe act. No visible systems were being prepared. No targeting radars were detected. But in naval operations, intent is not judged only by obvious signals. Position, movement, timing, and formation all matter. And the geometry was changing quickly. The 5 Venezuelan vessels began forming a loose arc ahead of the carrier's forward sector. It was not tight enough to be called a full surround, but it was also not wide enough to look like normal passage. It was a pressure formation, close enough to send a message, distant enough to deny that anything improper was happening. The U.S. response came first through procedure, not force. A bridge-to-bridge call was sent across open maritime frequencies. This is a United States Navy vessel operating in international waters. You are approaching on an unsafe vector. State your intentions. There was no answer.
The message was repeated, first in English, then in Spanish. Still nothing. On radar, the 5 contacts continued moving closer. At that moment, the situation moved from unclear to intentional. In professional naval practice, silence after a coordinated maneuver carries meaning. It shows a choice has been made. And once a choice is made, responsibility follows. The carrier strike group increased its level of awareness, but not its posture. Electronic monitoring systems began recording emissions from the approaching vessels. Long-range optical sensors turned toward the contacts and stabilized, capturing high-resolution imagery. Every wake, every slight course adjustment, every radar pulse was marked, timed, and archived. Visually, the American formation changed almost not at all. No sudden turns, no dramatic speed changes, no outward display meant to provoke a response. That restraint was deliberate. An aircraft carrier is not just another ship moving through open water. It is a floating command platform connected to satellites, aircraft, undersea assets, and surface vessels far beyond what can be seen from the horizon. Any bold move toward it is never just a local event. It becomes a strategic message. The Venezuelan vessels were now close enough for individual hull details to be identified. They appeared to be older platforms with limited air defense capability and modest surface equipment. They did not have a realistic way to directly challenge a carrier group.
Which made the real question even more important. If they were not there to overpower the formation, then why were they there at all? The answer was not about strength, it was about pressure. For Caracas, forcing a US carrier to react, even slightly, could be presented as a sign of resolve. For Washington, responding the wrong way could create escalation, headlines, and consequences far beyond the Caribbean. So the carrier held its course. At 3:24 p.m., the closest point of approach was recalculated. The margin was shrinking. The pattern was no longer just a projection on a screen. It was becoming a real-world test of discipline, patience, and control. This was no longer a routine transit. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels had made their move, and the US Navy was preparing to answer without using force. At 3:25 p.m., the distance continued to narrow. On the surface, the scene still looked strangely calm. There were no alarms echoing across the deck, no dramatic signals, no aircraft roaring low overhead. To anyone without training, it may have looked like several smaller ships moving across open water. But inside the carrier strike group, every second mattered. The nearest Venezuelan vessel had moved within 12 nautical miles. That number was important not because it marked a legal line, but because it changed the tactical picture. At that range, there is less room for assumptions. Reaction time becomes shorter. Intent begins to matter much more. Another bridge-to-bridge message was transmitted.
This is a United States Navy vessel. You are maneuvering toward a US carrier operating lawfully in international waters. Acknowledge. Again, there was no response, no static, no delayed answer, no explanation. Only 5 hulls, 5 wakes, and 5 steady courses continuing forward. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere stayed controlled, but the focus sharpened. The watch team updated the closest point of approach in real time. Bearings were called out in calm, precise voices, almost as if this were a routine training scenario. But it was not. By now, the pattern was clear enough to remove any serious doubt. The Venezuelan vessels were not simply passing by. They were not holding a parallel track from a safe distance. Their formation was slowly tightening, pressing inward just enough to send a message without crossing the line that would demand an immediate response. This was gray zone pressure. For the US Navy, that kind of encounter can be more challenging than an open confrontation. It is not the kind of moment that instantly becomes a major incident. It is the kind of moment designed to test patience, discipline, and restraint. On the bridge, the captain listened without rushing the situation. Every report was measured against rules written for exactly these kinds of tense encounters. The carrier maintained its course. That choice mattered more than it appeared.
A change in speed or direction could have been interpreted immediately.
Any visible adjustment might be presented as a reaction, and in moments like this, even a defensive reaction can be turned into a political message. So the strike group relied on its strongest advantage: awareness. Electronic specialists monitored signals coming from the Venezuelan vessels. Low-power surface search radar activity was detected. It was not an openly aggressive signal, but it confirmed that the ships were actively tracking the carrier's movement. Long-range optical systems fed live images to multiple displays. Hull numbers, deck activity, bridge behavior, crew positions – every detail was captured and preserved. The entire encounter was becoming a record. At 3:29 p.m., the nearest Venezuelan ship adjusted course again, by only a few degrees. It was a small movement, almost subtle enough to dismiss, but it reduced the projected closest point of approach even further. That was the moment the situation became impossible to ignore. Inside the operations center, the meaning was understood without anyone needing to dramatize it. The carrier strike group could not allow the geometry to tighten much more without making its control of the situation clear. But control did not have to mean escalation. The next move did not come from the carrier's hull. It came from above the water. Flight operations were approved. A Seahawk helicopter was prepared for launch, configured not for confrontation, but for observation, identification, and presence. Its purpose was simple: get a clearer view from closer range without forcing the ships themselves into a sharper standoff. As the helicopter lifted away from the carrier, the formation below did not suddenly change. There was no visible overreaction, no dramatic shift in posture. But the message was clear. The encounter was no longer only being watched from the sea. Now it had eyes in the air. From above, the picture became much sharper. The Seahawk's sensors picked up details that were harder to judge from the deck: crew movement, bridge activity, visible equipment, and small course adjustments. The helicopter stayed offset and controlled, careful not to pass directly overhead or create a new point of tension. It was presence without provocation. The Venezuelan vessels noticed. Deck crews became more active. Personnel gathered near bridge areas. One vessel appeared to ease its speed, its wake shortening slightly. Another maintained its heading, but stopped closing in the same way. Still, no radio response came. And at that point, the silence said almost everything. In modern naval encounters, communication is not just formality. It is one of the simplest ways to reduce tension. Refusing to answer while maneuvering in a coordinated way is not a neutral act. It is a choice, and that choice places responsibility on the side that remains silent. By then, the carrier strike group had what it needed. The intent had been documented, behavior was recorded, every option remained open. The US Navy had not escalated, had not issued dramatic threats, and had not given away a single sign of uncertainty. But the pressure had now turned around completely. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels were facing a carrier group that had not shifted course by even a degree, yet had quietly taken control of the entire encounter. And the next decision point was coming fast. At 3:32 p.m., the balance changed almost silently. From the carrier's bridge, the scene looked unchanged. Course remained steady. Speed stayed the same. The massive ship continued cutting through the calm Caribbean water, as though the 5 Venezuelan vessels were barely a factor. But behind that calm exterior, the situation had moved into a different phase. Above the water, the Seahawk helicopter settled into a steady orbit of the starboard side of the nearest Venezuelan ship. Its sensors began sending continuous video and data back to the carrier and the escorts around it. What had started as radar tracks and projected movement was now clear visual evidence. Every turn could be seen, every pause could be measured, every small adjustment was being recorded. The helicopter crew stayed disciplined. No sharp movements, no low passes, no dramatic maneuvers, just steady presence, controlled, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Then came a calm transmission. Venezuelan naval vessel. This is a United States Navy helicopter operating in international waters. Your movements are being recorded. Maintain safe distance. The same message was repeated in Spanish. For the first time since the encounter began, the pattern changed. The lead Venezuelan ship reduced speed by 2 knots. It was a small adjustment, but it stood out immediately. Its bow wave softened. The tight spacing that had been pressing inward began to open. Seconds later, another ship did the same. It was not a withdrawal, not yet. But the coordinated pressure that had defined their approach was starting to break apart. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, there was no celebration. The team simply updated the plot. Bearings widened. The closest point of approach increased little by little. The data told the story before anyone had to say it. The Venezuelan formation was losing cohesion. This is the point where many tense encounters can change direction. Pride can push one side to go further than planned. One careless move can undo all the restraint that came before it. The US Navy did not push. The Seahawk held its orbit. Sensors stayed focused. The carrier maintained course. Nothing was made louder than it needed to be, and that was exactly why the move worked. By refusing to react emotionally, the carrier strike group denied Venezuela the one thing pressure tactics are often designed to create: a visible reaction. There would be no sharp course change for cameras to frame. No heated radio exchange to replay. No dramatic scene to twist into a political message. Only evidence. At 3:36 p.m., the third Venezuelan ship changed course by about 5 degrees to port. It was just enough to break alignment with the carrier's path, and just careful enough to signal reconsideration without making the move look like a public setback. Moments later, the fourth ship followed. The final vessel held on the longest, maintaining speed and heading as if waiting for something. Perhaps an order, perhaps a signal that never arrived. The Seahawk shifted slightly closer while still keeping a safe distance. Its cameras focused on the bridge area of the remaining ship. A visual marker briefly appeared, not as a threat, but as a clear signal. You are seen. You are documented. You are responsible. That was the message. Finally, the last Venezuelan ship reduced speed. The formation dissolved. No announcement was made. No acknowledgement came over the radio. The Venezuelan ships did not make a dramatic turn or rush away from the area. Instead, they separated one by one, taking independent headings that led them away from the carrier's track. For Caracas, it was the cleanest exit available. For the US Navy, it was success without a single round used. By 3:41 p.m., the nearest contact was steadily opening distance. The carrier strike group remained intact, unchanged, and fully in control. The Seahawk completed one final orbit, then turned back toward the carrier. Its mission was complete. The encounter was over. But the meaning of the encounter remained long after the ships moved apart. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels had tried to place pressure on a US aircraft carrier in international waters. They had done it deliberately, silently, and in coordination. Yet in the end, they stepped away not because they were directly confronted, but because they were outmatched in discipline, awareness, and control. In modern naval standoffs, the outcome is not always measured by dramatic scenes on the horizon. Sometimes, the most important result is what never happens. No major incident, no damage, no panic-driven headlines. Just a message delivered clearly, without the US Navy needing to use force. The carrier continued forward, steady and unchanged. Behind it, the Caribbean slowly returned to silence. By 3:45 p.m., the situation had fully cooled down. The 5 Venezuelan ships were now separated by miles of open water, each moving on its own heading. None of their routes continued to intersect with the carrier strike group. On radar, their tracks no longer showed converging movement. They had shifted back into ordinary surface contacts, no longer treated as an immediate tactical concern. Aboard the US carrier, the rhythm stayed the same. Flight operations remained secured. Escort ships kept their positions.
The entire strike group continued its transit exactly as planned,
Almost as if the encounter had never happened. But that steadiness was not accidental. It was the final message of the entire episode. In naval strategy, what happens after a tense moment can matter just as much as what happens during it. A sudden change after the fact can make an encounter look larger than it was. A calm continuation shows confidence. Inside the Combat Information Center, the mission shifted from live monitoring to review and analysis. Every second of the encounter had already been preserved. Radar tracks, infrared imagery, radio records, electronic signatures. The timeline was complete. And the timeline told a simple story. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels maneuvered together toward a US aircraft carrier operating in international waters. They did so without answering radio calls. They continued moving closer despite repeated messages. Only after US surveillance made their actions clearly visible did their formation begin to break apart. There was little room for interpretation. For Washington, that record mattered far beyond the Caribbean. It provided clarity in a space where competing narratives often move faster than the facts. Any attempt to claim the carrier acted aggressively would now face a detailed record showing restraint, discipline, and adherence to established maritime practice. For Caracas, the situation was more complicated. The goal had never been a true military challenge.
Venezuela's Navy did not have the practical ability to seriously pressure a carrier strike group in direct terms. What it could try to create was friction, a tense moment that could later be presented as resistance at home or as US provocation abroad. That effort did not succeed. There were no dramatic images of an American carrier turning away, no heated radio exchange to replay, no sharp response that could be reframed as escalation. What remained instead was silence, distance, and a quiet disengagement that said more than any official broadcast could. Strategically, that outcome favored the side that never raised its voice. The US Navy demonstrated something more important than raw strength. It demonstrated control. Control of space, control of timing, control of the narrative. That is the heart of modern naval deterrence. Power is no longer measured only by the size of ships or the range of advanced systems. It is measured by the ability to absorb pressure without reacting impulsively, to let the other side reveal its intentions, and then to respond in a way that leaves little room for distortion. That is exactly what happened in the days that followed. No major public escalation followed. No dramatic statement turned the encounter into a larger crisis. The episode passed without becoming a headline-grabbing incident, precisely because it had been handled in a way that denied anyone the spectacle they might have wanted.
But make no mistake, within military and diplomatic circles, it was noticed. Navies that operate in contested waters study moments like this carefully. They look not only at who changed course, but how it happened. They study timing, restraint, signals, and discipline. And the lesson from this encounter was clear. You can approach a US carrier. You can try to create pressure. You can attempt to shape the moment. But you cannot force the US Navy to react on your terms. The carrier did not need to change direction, issue dramatic warnings, or make a visible show of strength. Its advantage came from patience, evidence, and discipline. For the sailors involved, the encounter would likely become another entry in the ship's record. A measured response to a serious challenge. No celebration, no public victory lap, no dramatic moments on deck. And that was part of the message. The strike group continued forward, leaving behind a quiet stretch of Caribbean water and 5 vessels that had just discovered where the boundary really was. In the modern maritime world, restraint is not weakness, it is influence. And on that afternoon in the Caribbean, it was influence, not raw power, that shaped the outcome. Long after the 5 Venezuelan vessels had faded into distant radar contacts, the meaning of the encounter continued to spread outward. At sea, the moment had ended. Strategically, it had only begun.
Incidents like these often pass without major public attention, because there is no dramatic scene for people to watch. No collision, no sudden crisis, no shocking image from the horizon. To an ordinary observer, it may look as though almost nothing happened, but to planners, analysts, and allied navies watching quietly from a distance, everything about it mattered. This was a clear example of modern naval signaling. Venezuela tested the boundary. The United States defined it without overstepping it. That difference is important. In today's maritime environment, direct confrontation is usually the outcome every side wants to avoid. Instead, nations often operate in the gray zone, a space where pressure is applied carefully, where messages are implied rather than announced, and where each side tries to shape the other's reaction. That is exactly what unfolded in the Caribbean. Caracas attempted to create tactical friction, 5 vessels moving together, coordinated timing, and deliberate silence. The objective was not to directly challenge the carrier group in practical terms. The goal was to force attention, to make the US formation react in a way that could later be framed, debated, and amplified. But what they met instead was strategic denial. The US Navy refused to provide the reaction they were looking for. No sudden turns, no dramatic warnings, no visible overreaction that could be turned into a political story.
Instead, the carrier strike group remained steady and allowed the Venezuelan vessels to reveal their own intent through movement, silence, and timing. Once those actions were documented, the ambiguity disappeared. That is not passivity, that is discipline. And discipline sends its own signal. Navies around the world study moments like this because they help establish precedent. They answer a question every commander understands when operating near a more capable force. How far can pressure go before the response changes? On that afternoon, the answer was clear. You can approach, you can posture, you can test the situation. But when your strategy depends on uncertainty and silence, you do not control the outcome. The side that controls the tempo and the record controls the encounter. For the United States, this reinforced a broader approach seen across major waterways around the world. Whether in the Caribbean, the South China Sea, or the Red Sea, the principle remains the same. Maintain presence, uphold international rules, and deny opposing forces the emotional reaction they may be trying to provoke. It is a strategy built on confidence. Not the kind of confidence that needs constant displays of strength, but the kind that trusts procedure over impulse. The kind that understands every radar contact, every course adjustment, and every unanswered message can become part of a much larger conversation. For Venezuela, the lesson was just as clear.
Pressure without real capability has limits. Symbolic moves can fall apart when met with patience. Silence, once recorded, can become a weakness rather than an advantage. The 5 vessels eventually returned to routine operations. The carrier continued its transit. Officially, little more needed to be said. But inside command centers and planning rooms, the encounter became something more than a passing incident. It became a case study, another data point showing how modern naval power is exercised not through drama, but through control. And that leaves us with the question that matters most. In a world where naval forces often meet without a single shot being fired, where the most important moments unfold quietly on radar screens, sensor feeds, and radio silence, what does strength really look like? Is it a louder response? Or is it restraint, backed by capability that everyone understands is there? Should the United States answer these encounters with a more forceful posture? Or is holding the line calmly, without turning a tense moment into a crisis, the smarter form of power? There is no simple answer to that question, and maybe there should not be. Because the most serious moments at sea are not always the ones that become visible to the public. They are the moments when discipline is tested, when one decision can change the entire situation, and when restraint becomes just as important as strength. On that afternoon in the Caribbean, discipline held. No one crossed the line. No one gave in to impulse. And because of that, the sea stayed calm. At least for now. So, what do you think? Would you have handled the situation differently? Or was this the right balance between power and restraint? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real-world naval encounters explained with clarity, detail and context, make sure you are subscribed. To support the channel directly, you can also consider joining the fleet. Because out on the open ocean, the most important confrontations are often the ones that never become visible.